In just 1 week in 1967, Israel decisively defeats 3 Arab armies in what would become known as the Six-Day War. But how did Israel, fighting on 3 fronts, manage such a quick and decisive victory, and why couldn't the Arab states react in time? Nearly 20 years after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Middle East is still in the grip of the political consequences of the establishment of the Jewish state. Palestinians in the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip and Jordanian-controlled West Bank remain hopeful that a future war will destroy Israel and lead to a Palestinian state in its place. Meanwhile, Syria supports Palestinian groups like Fatah with the goal of attacking and destabilizing Israel. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who hopes to become the leader of the Arab world amidst a surge in pan-Arab nationalism, feels confident after the US and USSR intervened to Egypt's benefit in the 1956 Suez Crisis. At the same time, Israel has emerged militarily strengthened but remains geographically isolated and surrounded by hostile states. Before 1967, Israel's Arab neighbors were divided. In 1961, Syrian officers who supported Nasser and his pan-Arab ideas launched a failed coup which caused the Ba'athist socialist government in Damascus to purge the government and army and damaged Syrian-Egyptian relations. Jordan's King Hussein was at odds with Egypt over policy towards the Palestinians, even surviving an Egyptian assassination attempt in 1962. The rejection and eventual destruction of Israel remains one issue that unites the Arab states. Most Arab leaders play to popular opinion and take a strong political stance against Israel, and cross-border raids are common. Syrian troops and Palestinian militants target Israeli civilians, especially along the Golan Heights, resulting in Israeli reprisals. Syria uses these reprisals to humiliate Egypt for perceived inaction against Israel. After one such Palestinian attack on November 13, 1966, Israeli forces raid the West Bank village of Samu. Nasser doesn't want to provoke Israel and does nothing, which results in more criticism from Syria and Jordan that Egypt has abandoned the Arab cause. The situation is compounded by another escalation on April 7, 1967, when Syrian shelling of Israeli border towns provokes Israeli bombing of Syrian artillery positions. Syria scrambles MiG-21s, but Israeli Mirage fighter jets shoot down 7 and swoop over Damascus in victory. With each clash, public pressure builds in both Israel and the Arab states to respond to perceived threats. On May 14th, the USSR warns Nasser that Israel may imminently attack Syria. The reason for this warning isn't clear, but it was not true. Soviet, Syrian, and Egyptian sources realized this days later, but by then it's too late. President Nasser, unwilling to be seen as weak, orders Egyptian Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer to send Egyptian units into the Sinai, closer to Israel. On May 19th, the United Nations Emergency Force, or UNEF, which was stationed on the Egyptian-Israeli border since 1956, evacuates the Sinai on the demand of Nasser. The same day, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol doubles the number of mobilized reserves and sends 300 tanks to the southern border. Nasser believes that by pressuring Israel, he can win popular support and improve his political standing in the region. On May 21st, he announces the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, which had been forced open by Israel in 1956. Nasser hopes this move will right a historical wrong, humiliate Israel, and boost his popularity without actually provoking a full-scale war. As thousands of Egyptian troops march through the streets of Cairo towards Sinai, the Arab public's expectations of war grow, and media like Radio Cairo broadcast fiery rhetoric. With the closing of the Gulf of Aqaba, Israel is faced with 2 alternatives, either of which will destroy it. It will either be strangled to death by the Arab military and economic boycott, or it will perish by the fire of the Arab forces encompassing it from the south and from the north and from the east. For Israel, the Straits of Tiran is a key economic shipping route, and the blockade is considered an act of war. The key piece of the Middle Eastern puzzle, Nasser's provision of a casus belli, had just fallen into place. In effect, the ball was now in our court. Prime Minister Eshkol orders a full military mobilization, bringing the Israeli economy to a halt. Women and children begin digging trenches and preparing mass graves in Tel Aviv as reserve troops are called up across the country. On June 4th, as Arab saber rattling grows louder, the Israeli War Cabinet votes for a preemptive strike. The attack is set for 7 a.m. on June 5th, 1967. On the eve of war, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, have 264,000 troops, including reservists, and 1,000 tanks, mostly modified World War II models. They also have well-trained crews for their 250 combat aircraft who can fly double sorties. Egypt has 100,000 troops and 950 tanks in Sinai, along with 282 combat aircraft, while Syria has 75,000 soldiers and 300 tanks in the Golan Heights and 120 fighter jets. Jordan, with a British-trained military, fields 55,000 troops, over 300 mostly modern tanks, and 24 modern fighter jets. Israeli leadership are determined that this war will be different than the close-run conflict in 1948, and the preemptive strike plan has been in development for years. Israeli intelligence agency Mossad has agents in most Arab militaries, including German-Israeli Wolfgang Lotz, who befriends senior Egyptian officers while posing as a former SS officer. These agents help Israel map out the location of every Egyptian plane on the ground, and often their pilot's name, rank, and even voice. Israeli pilots practice their flight plans, and they and the ground crews know their targets and schedules even before orders to take off arrive. Pilots take off at different times from different bases around Israel and maintain strict radio silence. By 7:30 a.m. on June 5th, almost 200 Israeli jets are heading towards their targets, flying low over Egypt to avoid radar detection. Coincidentally, Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries have no fire orders because Field Marshal Amer is landing at an airbase later the same morning. Within an hour, Israeli jets knock out almost all Egyptian air bases, sever communications cables between the Sinai and Egyptian Army HQ, kill over a third of Egypt's pilots, and destroy the majority of Egyptian combat aircraft. Egyptian pilot Hashim Mustafa remembers the scene. Some 30 seconds from the end of the attack, a second wave of planes arrived. We ran about in the desert looking for cover. It was a sad comedy. Pilots of the newest and best equipped jets fighting with handguns. A ratio of losses 100% for us, 0% for them. Israel loses just 9 out of 200 planes over Egypt. The Israeli Air Force also strikes Syrian and Jordanian airfields, destroying over half of the Syrian and most of the Jordanian aircraft and runways. The IDF attacks on the ground as well. On the coast, the armor bypasses Rafah and the Gaza Strip to maximize the speed of the attack into Sinai. Egyptian troops are taken by surprise as Israeli Centurion and Patton tanks appear at their positions. We were exposed to a heavy armor attack on several axes, with the sea to our backs in the north and constant aerial and artillery bombardment. We had almost no communications with other headquarters in the sector and no knowledge of what was happening on the battlefield. While Israeli tanks race for the canal in northern Sinai, another force led by Major General Ariel Sharon breaks through Egyptian defenses at Katef, heading towards Abu Agela. Israeli mechanized infantry and tanks launch assaults with massed artillery support, while paratroopers landed by helicopter destroy Egyptian artillery positions. By evening, the Egyptian 7th and 20th Divisions have been destroyed. At 4 p.m., an emotional Field Marshal Amer briefs President Nasser. They both agree to cover up the losses to ensure Syria and Jordan don't drop out of the war. By the end of the first day, Israel has effectively eliminated the combined Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces. In Sinai, Egyptian forces have lost their first defensive line and are falling back. In the east, King Hussein dashes Israeli hopes of Jordanian neutrality when he launches cross-border attacks. Israeli troops then push into the West Bank and towards East Jerusalem. Across the southern and eastern fronts, Jordanian and Egyptian troops are resisting, but Israeli speed, firepower, and coordination are too much. The next day, the battle for Jerusalem begins. After the 1948 war, Jerusalem was split along armistice lines. West Jerusalem becomes part of Israel, while East Jerusalem, including many holy sites, are under Jordanian control. The armistice line itself is a tangle of barbed wire and fortifications. Israeli troops have fortified the Mount Scopus exclave, while Jordanian troops garrison the Ottoman walls around the Old City. At 2 a.m. on June 6th, Israeli tanks, mortars, and rockets blast Jordanian positions. Israeli paratroopers fight an intense battle against the 2nd Al-Husseini Battalion over a heavily fortified position known as Ammunition Hill. Jordanian troops knock out 2 Israeli tanks, a Jordanian officer calls down artillery on his own position, and the fighting ends up in fierce hand-to-hand combat. The Israelis capture the hill at 5 a.m., but 31 Israelis and 71 Jordanians are dead. Israeli paratroopers also storm the American colony further south, but Jordanian troops ambush them after they make a wrong turn. Israeli paratrooper Yigal Nir remembers. Suddenly the street turned into a slaughterhouse. In seconds, everyone around me was hit. Having not felt fear before, the transformation was drastic. I felt abandoned and suddenly hopeless. Israeli tanks, bazooka teams, and paratroopers fighting in close quarters overcome strong Jordanian resistance. Israeli forces then push further, taking the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum, the railroad station, and the former UNEF headquarters in the south. Israeli aircraft, enjoying complete air superiority, smashed Jordanian reinforcements approaching from the east. King Hussein himself sees the aftermath of these strikes. I will never forget the hallucinating sight of that defeat. Roads clogged with all kinds of vehicles, twisted, disemboweled, dented, still smoking, giving off that particular smell of metal and paint burnt by exploding bombs. In the midst of this charnel house were men, wounded, exhausted. They were trying to clear a path under the monstrous coup de grace being dealt to them by a horde of Israeli mirages screaming in a cloudless blue sky seared with the sun. By midday, only the Old City remains in Jordanian hands. To the north, Syria attempts a ground offensive, but it's a disaster. Syrian tankers discover that the bridges they need to cross are too narrow for their T-34s, and local Israeli militia beat back the disjointed and only Syrian offensive of the war. At the same time, Israeli forces rout disorganized Egyptian resistance in Sinai and push towards the Canal Zone. In Gaza, surrounded on 3 sides by Israel, IDF units defeat Palestinian militia in urban combat. At nightfall, both Field Marshal Amer and King Hussein order retreats to new positions. After another day of Israeli success, Jerusalem's Old City is within reach, and the Egyptian army is more vulnerable than ever. Overnight on June 7th, Jordanian soldiers in Jerusalem's Old City can see columns of reinforcements hit by Israeli air power, and their supplies are running low. As Israeli forces begin to encircle them, Jordanian troops pull back, leaving the Old City nearly undefended. Israeli Colonel Mordecai Gur of the 55th Paratroop Brigade sends a message to his battalion commanders. We occupy the heights overlooking the Old City. In a little while, we will enter it. The ancient city of Jerusalem, which for generations we have dreamt of and striven for. We will be the first to enter it. The Jewish nation is awaiting our victory. Israel awaits this historic hour. Be proud. Good luck. A few minutes later, Gur's paratroopers are standing on the Haram al-Sharif, or Temple Mount, and soon they reach the Western Wall. For many Israelis and supporters in the Jewish diaspora, photos of this moment become the defining images of the war. For King Hussein, however, it's a disaster. His army and air force are destroyed, part of his kingdom is lost, and he's failed to protect Islam's third holiest site. On the Egyptian front, Israeli troops land unopposed by sea at Sharm el-Sheikh, reopening the Straits of Tiran. The Egyptian army is now approaching a breaking point. As Egyptian tanks, trucks, and troops crowd the roads, Israeli jets attack them with napalm, bombs, and cannon, while IDF ground forces sprint ahead to the Mitla and Gidi passes. There they ambush the already confused Egyptian units on their way to the Suez Canal. Egyptian forces resist as best they can, including effective use of T-55 tanks against Israeli AMX light tanks. But what starts as an orderly Egyptian withdrawal becomes a rout. Everyone lost their heads. We were told to withdraw, but we arrived to find the positions there already in flames. The army on the roads was in a state of complete collapse. It was a massacre, a disaster. The next day, June 8th, the disaster in Sinai continues. The IDF captures so many Egyptian prisoners of war that they disarm and release them to cross the Suez Canal on foot. There are also reports of Israeli soldiers executing Egyptian troops during the retreat. Israeli forces reach the canal in northern Sinai. 80% of the Egyptian army's equipment has been lost, including 10,000 trucks, 700 tanks, and hundreds of guns. In the confusion of the advance, Israeli planes and torpedo boats attacked the US Navy intelligence ship USS Liberty off the Egyptian coast, killing 34 American crew members. The incident leads to American and Israeli investigations about fault and compensation that rule it an accident. While Egyptian propaganda praises Egyptian victories in Sinai, President Nasser and Field Marshal Amer privately accept that the war is lost. At 7:43 p.m., Nasser announces Egypt will accept a UN ceasefire and plans to resign. Spontaneous protests across Egypt press him not to resign, so he stays on, but Egypt's war is over. Now, with Jordan and Egypt out of the war, the IDF turns to Syria. Syria's defensive lines on the Golan Heights are entrenched in steep, rocky terrain and overlook Israeli positions. Minefields surround the few roads onto the heights, and Syrian troops have dug in tanks and artillery. Bunkers offer some protection against Israeli airstrikes as well. However, Syrian units are poorly trained, lack cohesive leadership due to recent purges, and lack effective air cover and air defenses. Syrian tanks are outdated, even including World War II-era German Panzer IV tanks. On June 9th at 9:40 a.m., Israel unleashes a massive air and artillery barrage aided by intelligence collected from spy Eli Cohen. Israel makes over 1,000 airstrikes against Syrian positions, but aren't effective in destroying Syrian bunkers. Syrian defenders inflict heavy casualties on Israeli tanks and bulldozers as they slowly push forward to clear boulders and mines. When Israeli infantry finally reach Syrian trenches, it takes hours for them to drive out the Syrian defenders, and 30 Israelis and 60 Syrians are killed. When Israeli forces attack again on June 10th, they find Syrian defenses abandoned, as Syrian units have withdrawn towards Quneitra. But Syrian radio mistakenly announces that Quneitra is already lost, which causes panic amongst Syrian army units who retreat in confusion towards Damascus. Even Syrian front commander Ahmad al-Mir flees on horseback in the chaos. An Israeli commander reports, "We arrived almost without hindrance at the gates of Quneitra. Everything was in working order. Tanks with their engines still running, communication equipment still in operation. We captured Quneitra without a fight." In the afternoon of June 10th, with the road to Damascus undefended, Syria accepts a UN ceasefire. After 6 days of near constant combat across 3 fronts, the 6-day war is over. So how did Israel manage such a complete victory? First, Israel's preemptive strike was a surprise. Arab air defenses were simply not prepared for a full-scale war. This allowed Israel's air force to eliminate the entire Egyptian, Jordanian, and most of the Syrian air force on the first day, giving Israel complete air superiority. This allowed the Israeli Air Force to concentrate on one front at a time. Second, the Egyptian and Syrian armies suffered from rampant corruption and conscripts lacked food and ammunition. Many were barely trained. Jordan's army was professional, but too small to hold the West Bank on its own. Third, flawed leadership. Field Marshal Amer, who'd been appointed largely because of his friendship with Nasser, didn't respond quickly or effectively to the attack. By ordering a premature retreat, Amer exposed his army to a total rout, and some officers even abandoned their men during battle. Syrian political purges had hollowed out their officer corps entirely. While the 6-day war was quick, it still took a grim human toll. Israel lost 679 soldiers killed, with 15 captured. Arab casualties are harder to estimate. Egypt lost about 11,000 dead with around 5,000 captured, Jordan 6,000 dead and 500 captured, and Syria 1,000 dead with 600 captured. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, hoping war would lead to independence, instead found themselves under Israeli occupation. For the first time, Israel found itself responsible in part for hundreds of thousands of Arabs who did not live within its official borders. In the West Bank, some 240,000 Palestinians fled to Jordan and other Arab countries as refugees. In the Golan Heights, Arab Druze villages found themselves separated from family and friends on the Syrian-controlled side. In some Muslim countries, there's a wave of anti-Semitic violence against local Jewish communities. Riots in Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Morocco, Lebanon, Iraq, and Tunisia see Jews arrested, beaten or killed, synagogues burnt, and many expelled. The Six-Day War had lasting political consequences as well. Israel found itself militarily dominant for the first time, and suddenly 3 times larger territorially. For many Israelis, the war was a miraculous retelling of the David and Goliath story. In the Arab world, the war becomes known as the Naksa, or the setback. Arab states vow revenge and refuse to recognize or make formal peace with Israel, which leaves the region at risk of another war. For Palestinians, the Six-Day War led to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, a situation that has yet to be resolved nearly 60 years later. The Six-Day War was another step in the escalation of the Middle East conflict and another proxy battlefield of the Cold War. Just before the Six-Day War, Israel likely acquired its first nuclear weapon and considered nuclear energy for civilian use, much like many countries at the time did. In the Soviet Union, the vision of nuclear-powered communism had survived Stalin, and the first atomgrads, or atom cities, were being planned, one of them near the Ukrainian village of Pripyat. If you're interested to learn more about the Soviet nuclear program from its origins in World War II to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond, you can watch our new documentary series Red Atoms exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service we're building together with other creators and where we don't have to worry about the algorithm or advertising guidelines, and where viewers directly support creators. If you go to nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can get 40% off an annual subscription. For just $30 a year, you can watch Red Atoms or our other Nebula original series. And if you really want to support what we're doing on Nebula, the Nebula Lifetime membership is available again for $300. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, 1/3 of this money will directly support us here at Realtime History, and the rest will help develop bigger Nebula original documentaries in the future with bigger budgets. The Lifetime membership is about supporting us and Nebula so that we can realize even better history videos. By the way, this option is also available for existing Nebula subscribers. So head over to nebula.tv/realtimehistory and support us here at Realtime History directly. We want to thank Michael Adato for his help with this episode. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description below. And if you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Realtime History, the only history channel that has the key to the Middle Eastern puzzle.